Welcome to the Film Florida podcast. I'm John Lux, and I'm the Executive Director of Film Florida. Before we get to our interview, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the Film Florida podcast. If you're not already a member of Film Florida, please consider joining at filmflorida.org. If you like what you hear on the podcast, please consider going to our website and donating $20.22 for our 2022 fundraising campaign. We also have a Film Florida merchandise page. Visit filmflorida.creator-spring.com to purchase Film Florida t-shirts, sweatshirts, coffee mugs, and more. Larry Goebel is an industry veteran with more than 40 years of experience. His roles in the industry have included distribution, sales, business and legal affairs, acquisitions and development, marketing, and more. We talked to him about his career, the evolution of distribution of film and television products, his advice for up-and-coming industry professionals, and more on this episode of the Film Florida podcast. Here's my conversation with Larry Goebel. Welcome to the Film Florida podcast, Larry.
Well, thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with your origin story. Help the audience get to know where you came from a little bit.
Well, I was born and raised in Shreveport, Louisiana, back in the day before there was an actual film industry in Louisiana, and went to high school there, captain of the basketball team. While I was there, I was doing a little bit of sports reporting for the high school newspaper, and I started trying to figure out a way that I could combine my interest in sports and writing, but also I had a very healthy enjoyment of motion pictures. I had just seen The Graduate, and it's got me to thinking that that might be something I might want to entertain. But in any case, I went on to Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, got my degree in journalism there, and it was a great 4 years. I was actually a walk-on on the freshman basketball team when Al McGuire was coaching a few years before he won his national championship. But so that was great. I got to know a lot of the players, and after my freshman year, where it became very obvious that that was going to be the end of my competitive basketball career, at being 5'11" and 175 pounds.
I've been there, don't worry.
Yeah. So I started focusing on sports writing at the time, and eventually became sports editor of the Marquette Tribune. We had a couple of players that went on to the pros. We won an NIT championship, beating Pistol Pete Maravich and Dr. J in Madison Square Garden. And it was a great time, got to travel with the team. But along around there, I started taking some photojournalism and some documentary filmmaking classes, and really started thinking at that point that as much as I love sports writing, that my love of film was probably a little bit greater. And so when I graduated from Marquette, I had already applied to postgraduate school at USC here in Los Angeles, and got accepted for not the next semester, but the following semester in the spring. So when I graduated, I came out here and spent 6 months basically getting my feet wet and learning my way around Los Angeles, and got in my car. And of course, gasoline was 32 cents a gallon back then. So I could drive around and kind of explore the city. And in those explorations, I actually came across a film crew that was shooting. Turned out to be a film called Executive Action, starring Burt Lancaster and the late Robert Ryan.
Sure.
Well, actually, that was his last film. He passed away about 2 or 3 weeks after we wrapped shooting. But I got my first taste of, I got to know the assistant director, and he gave me the call sheet every day. So I kind of followed him around all of Los Angeles for 3 weeks, and watched the filmmaking process, and got to know a few people. And the following semester, I started at USC, and it was a great time. I learned a lot about the nuts and bolts of the production world. And of course, when I got out of school, I looked at Hollywood and said, Hollywood, here I am, hire me. And Hollywood let out a collective yawn. And basically said, yeah, there's 5,000 of you running around. And so, I took on some odd jobs out of school, to pay the rent. I was a gaffer on a bicentennial documentary film that was being done. I was assistant editor on a little low budget film that was, I'm not even sure it ever got released. But I remember then a buddy of mine who I'd gone to school with called me up one day and said, "Hey, I'm a production assistant over here on one of Roger Corman's little films. You want to come over and work on it?" And I went, "Well, that sounds interesting." And Roger was making $100,000 and $200,000 budget films and shooting them in 10 days and cranking them out for the drive-in business at that time. And I said, "Yeah, it might be an opportunity to network, meet some people, make a little bit of money." And he said, "Oh no, you're not going to make any money." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, this is Roger Corman. You're getting experience. You don't make any money on the first film, but if you do well, maybe there'll be a second film." And I went, "Well, look, these are short shoots. Maybe I can get, these are days before interns,
Right.
before you had to pay anybody." So I said, "Well, it's only a couple of weeks, I'll pay my dues." And I said, "Well, if I do well and get the second film, yeah, how much will I make on the second film?" And he said, "Oh no, you don't make any money on the second film. This is Roger Corman." And I said, "Look, dude, I gotta at some point I gotta start making a living here." So that was probably, as I look back on it, that was probably the sort of the fork in the road that got me moving toward the distribution world and away, at least for the time being, from the production world, because I ended up applying for and getting a job in the mailroom at a little company called Avco Embassy Pictures that was just moving their home office from New York out to Los Angeles. Some of the people made the move and some didn't, and they were hiring at the lowest rung in the mailroom. I think the pay was $95 a week or something at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I gladly jumped all over it. And it was my foot in the door. But, like 4 months later, there was an opening in one of the sales departments. And they said, "Hey, let's give it to the kid in the mailroom." And it really kind of set me in motion toward 40 plus year and the career in the distribution side of the business, because it was a great opportunity. This was, when I started, and it was the non-theatrical sales department. They didn't even know what to call it. It was everything other than film and television. And I was licensing films to the airlines and colleges and universities and the Army and Navy. And of course, back then it was mostly all film, 16 millimeter and maybe occasionally 35 millimeter to the Army circuit. But it opened my eyes to this whole important facet of the film industry that they really didn't teach too much about in film school.
They still don't.
And I think it's probably one of the reasons why I was always happy to go back throughout my career and maybe do some guest lecturing or being on panels, because a lot of film students, they do a great job of teaching you how to make movies, but then what do we do with it when we're finished with it? So that was a real eye-opening experience to me, and it was great. The timing was such that, like a year or two later, the head of the department moved on to another company, and I ascended to be the head of the non-theatrical sales department. And this was a time where home video and pay television and all, the new media at the time was just starting to get going. I mean, people were saying, "Who's HBO?" It was that kind of thing. And, what's a VHS tape? And Avco Embassy was no different. I mean, they were a reasonably successful, medium-sized company. They'd had success years before with The Graduate and Carnal Knowledge. And, and at the time, Bob Ramey, who ended up being the president of the Motion Picture Academy, came over to run Avco Embassy and really kind of kickstarted the company. As part of that, he basically allowed me to take over a lot of the area that the network division and the foreign division and the people who did theatrical releases, they just weren't familiar with this quote unquote new media. So they let me kind of take it over. And it was just a wonderful opportunity for a young man in the business who had a little bit of experience, but it was new technology. So, within the next couple of years, I was, helping put together some, multi-million-dollar licensing agreements with HBO and Showtime, and ventured into the home video business. I think we were the third company to license content to the home entertainment sector. I think 20th Century Fox was, I think, the first one with Patton and Hello Dolly and Sound of Music. And then a little company called Allied Artists came in with Cabaret and Man Who Would Be King and some of those titles. And then AFCO was the third company in licensing a lot of our library. And things were just really starting to take off. Our foreign division would come to me, and these are people who'd been in the business for 30 plus years, and say, Larry, what is this home video thing? I'm getting calls from Australia and the UK and France, and how do we license it? So I started dabbling in the international arena at that point as well, just more or less kind of guiding the senior officials in the foreign department. And then, I think I was there for about 5 years, and I was approached by a little company called Film Ventures, who no longer in business, but they wanted me to basically come over to their company, take over licensing everything except the U.S. theatrical rights. And that, I think, really was the springboard to, at that point, for the next 35 plus years, I started traveling around the world to the Cannes Film Festival, and there was, markets in Milan, Italy, and conferences in England. And it seemed like every few months, a new country was opening up, and everybody needed content. And so it was a way to really mine our libraries. Every couple of months, there'd be, another 50 picture deal with, you name it, Argentina or Taiwan. It was a wonderful time in the business. So that took me up to probably the mid to late 80s, where a Canadian producer named Pierre David, who had made the Scanners series with David Cronenberg. And I had met Pierre when we were at AFCO. And he and his partner, Renee Malo, in Canada, who had a very successful company called Malo Film, were setting up, he and their partners, Nelvana, another Canadian entity that was into animation, as well as a U.S. partner, Dimitri Villard. The four of them were setting up a new foreign sales company, and they asked me to come over and help run it. And from, mid to late 80s to probably the late 90s, it was a great run in the business. It was for everybody. I remember, I think how difficult it is in many ways now to license independent contract,
right?
Unless Netflix or Amazon or studios buying it. But I remember going to an American film market, Santa Monica, in probably the mid to late 90s. And we had a poster on the wall. That was it. We had a poster. And it wasn't even a big name star in it. And over the next week, we'd probably had 70 or 80 meetings with countries from around the world. And the conversation was a close variation of the following. They'd come in, they'd sit down and pick a country, Germany, Japan. And they go, "Oh, Larry, that looks interesting. Tell me more about that. When's it going into production?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." And they went, "Oh, well, who's starring in it?" And I said, "Well, we don't have it cast yet." And they go, "Well, okay, well, who's directing it?" And I said, "I don't know. We haven't hired a director yet." And they'd say, "Well, and can we at least read the script?" And I'd say, "Yeah, as soon as we write it." And they'd be this long pause, and then they'd say, "Well, how much do you want for it?" I'd look at my chart, and it was Germany. I'd say, whatever, 250,000. And they go, "Oh, Larry, way too much. How about 200?" And we do a deal at 225. I'd check it off my list, and we'd go to Japan. And Long story short, at the end of the week, we had over $2 million of pre-sales on
Wow.
a project that we hadn't even written the script for yet. That was back when it was very competitive. Nobody in a country wanted to get left out, and they felt like they had to get in early. So, of course, the pressure was on us to end up making and delivering a saleable movie, or else they would
Right.
never pre-bought anything else from us again. But on that particular film, like I said, we did over $2 million of sales, and we didn't even sell the US, which we sold after we started production and for another $700,000, I think. So I remember at the end of the AFM, I was sitting down with Pierre and Renee, and we had this conversation. Well, how much money do we want to make on this film? And the question was, what budget did we want to make it for? With the, we're going to shoot it in Canada with the Canadian tax credits. And, my company at the time had to take a modest distribution fee and recoup expenses. And it was sort of reverse engineered from what we had sold versus what we could make it for and still deliver a film that didn't disappoint the customers who bought it. So, yeah, very different. I would oftentimes tell that story to film students over the last 10 years, and they would look at me slack-jawed like, what planet did you just step off of? But we didn't realize it at the time how good we had it. But that was really the difference of.
Well, and from your perspective, why have things changed so much in the distribution model?
Oh boy, John, that's it's a good question. I would say there's probably not one answer.
Right.
I tend to look at the risk reward formula as kind of a pendulum that swings back and forth at different points in time. And obviously back then, the risk was pretty much over on the buyers. They were having to buy something that because of competitive balance or what have you, there were so many other. I know South Africa one time showed up, and there were like 27 companies that were trying to acquire product. And we all kind of looked at each other saying, this is not that big of a country,
right,
that it can support 27 companies that are trying to license content. But it was a kind of a gold rush, I guess, at the time, that everybody wanted to plant their flag. But since then, that pendulum has swung pretty much all the way back over onto the investors and the producers now. Yeah. That the buyers are sitting back going, yeah, show me what you got. You pay for it, you develop it, you produce it and show it to me as a finished product, and then I'll tell you whether I want it or not. And right. That's pretty much where we're in. How we got there over the last 20 years or so, I think technology has had a lot to do with it. The sort of, if you want to call it, the demise of the home video DVD business, which was more of a, if you think about it, it's kind of a packaged goods business. Like I could sit down with my buyer in the UK and they would know how many units that they were going to sell to the local grocery store chain or the local video, whether their version of Best Buy or, at the time, Blockbuster. Mm-hmm. I'm going to do 100,000 units here. I'm going to sell 50,000 units there. And we could kind of pencil in within 10% or so, we could pretty much pencil in what we were going to be able to sell content for in a particular country. And so we'd go down the list. We're going to do the UK for this. We're going to do Germany for this. We're going to do Japan for that. And you get down to the bottom and you have a high-low range. And, depending upon how conservative or optimistic you want to be, we could come up with numbers that we could then, look at a completed film, for instance, if we were acquiring it or even if we were producing it, we could figure out what cast we needed to put in there. And we kind of knew what the market was going to be on a worldwide basis, how much we were going to get out of the US, how much we were going to get out of foreign. If you had a big name in there, you might have a shot at theatrical, but if you didn't, you had this pretty much of a good safety net out of the home video business, out of pay TV and home video.
Right.
But when that started going away, and also at the same time in the early 2000s, pretty much a worldwide basis, the reality TV shows started coming in, which the networks realized were a very cost-effective way that got ratings, that got return eyeballs on a daily and a weekly basis. And they started moving away from licensing feature films, which are basically a one-shot deal. I mean,
Right.
Most people don't watch a film more than once, or twice at the most. And so with the DVD, which was strong probably up until 5 to 7 years ago, but the reality TV shows and low-cost game shows started replacing feature films in the lineups and the programming decisions of most program directors, not only here but around the world. And so, little by little, our ability to be able to process and analyze and put numbers on how much money we were going to get at the end of the day started diminishing. Now, I still have a couple of projects that I'm attempting to raise financing for, but it's a challenge because when you sit with an investor and they look at the script or the package you put together and they go, I like it, how much is the budget and how am I getting my money back? It's a bit more daunting when you say, well, I don't know if Netflix is going to buy this. If they do and they like it, we might make a lot of money. If they don't like it and they pass, and Amazon passes and Hulu passes, it's like, what's there left? Yeah, you can go to YouTube or, some of these other places. But I guess what I'm saying is it's not a tier. It's not
Right.
like, well, if we don't make 3 million, we'll make 2.5. If we don't make 2.5, we'll make 1.8, and then you go down. You either make pretty good money or you don't make much money at all. And I've never been one to like blow smoke at investors and really paint overly optimistic. But what you do is you say, look, what I say to them is, what is your tolerance for risk here on this project? We'll do whatever we can, cast wise, budget wise, production wise, to minimize the risk. But at the end of the day, there's a risk here. I mean, yeah, you can take the project to the streaming services and they might like it. And, if they do, they're going to want to pay for it and own it. HBO 40 years ago learned that licensing a blockbuster film for 18 months at, a 8-figure license fee was not as good as taking that 8-figure license fee and putting it into a series and owning the series in perpetuity.
Right.
That's when things like Sex and the City and Sopranos, and you started seeing more of that, and then Showtime picked up on it, and then before you know it, now it's like a lot of stars would rather do really good episodic cable television than feature films.
Yep.
Yeah, I would say that to answer your question, it's a long roundabout way of saying it's a series of things that happened in the business, and this is where we find ourselves now. But with that being said, it's probably the greatest time since I've been doing this, and maybe in the history of the business, where we've had both the quantity and quality of content available for the consumer. The consumer's been the beneficiary of all these changes.
Right. Yeah, we talk about that all the time, that there's never been more content available, which it's a mixed bag. That means the consumers have more to choose from. That means, in theory, there's more money available to make content. But then there's the question of anybody can make something. It's just, how do you make sure that somebody sees it once it's made?
Bingo. I was having a conversation a couple of years ago with a friend of mine, and he said, Larry, the good news is anybody can make a movie now. The bad news is anybody can make a movie.
Exactly.
Because, now where is the consumer supposed to go to find it? And, you used to be able to find little gems, and, probably to a certain degree, we still can. I don't know, COVID's been a real sort of monkey wrench in the last couple of years, but film festivals used to be a great place to discover sort of hidden gems. And you can still do that to a certain degree, but nowadays, I mean, look at Sundance. I mean, most of the films coming out of Sundance have major stars in them, or major directors, or they've been pre-sold before the festival starts because the agencies are repping them. And And the agencies are now with international divisions, and they've taken over a lot of the space that independent sales agents used to go to. I mean, you were talking about the quantity out there. I know a few years ago I was at the European film market in Berlin, and I was talking to now this would have been in like February, whatever that year was, and the American film market would have been in November, like 3 months before.
Mm-hmm.
So two pretty close, sales markets, one at the end of the year, one at the very beginning of the year, with the year-end holidays in between. So I was sitting there in Berlin, and I don't know why the thought struck me, but I just started looking around and seeing just hundreds and hundreds of new titles available that I wasn't aware of. And there's hundreds of sales agents from all around the world. They're all bringing 2, 3, 4, 5 new projects every sales market. And I asked this buddy of mine, I said, let me ask you something. I said, how many new projects are you being offered, either completed films or scripts or new projects are you being offered here in Berlin? And he looked through his notes and did a quick calculation, and he said, oh, probably 200, 225, something like that. And I said, well, some of those are carryovers from 3 months ago at the AFM, right? And he goes, no. He said, those are brand new ones. I said, well, how many were you offered at the AFM? He goes, probably about the same. And that, John, this light bulb went off in my head. I said, wait a minute, are you telling me that in the last 3 months, you in your country, and you have 5 or 6 major competitors, you've been offered between 400 and 450 titles? He goes, yeah, probably.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, these 400 some odd projects have already made the cut, because we look at 50 projects for every 1 or 2 or 3 that we decide to go for. And, we're lucky if we get one of them. So there's all these films that are being made that aren't even making the cut, so to speak, to get a representation. And I said, so 400, I said, how many of those are actually going to be licensed eventually in your country? He goes, well, 50 maybe. So I paused. He goes, what's your point? And at this point, I've known the guy forever. He started to get a little irritated. He goes, what's your point? And I said, I guess I'm trying to figure out what's going to happen to the 350 or so plus that don't get licensed. And he looked at me and he goes, why should I give a damn? That's not my problem. That's your problem. That's your investors, your producers' problems. I'm just trying to make a buck here.
Yeah.
And it just hit me all of a sudden that this is such a numbers game, that I think I kind of sensed that, but I didn't realize it had reached that point, that there were that many projects that were being made. As I said earlier, anybody can make a film now. And the buyers, the territorial distributors, the licensees, they're trying to find what's commercially viable. What are the projects that they can support marketing dollars wise in their own country? What are the ones? And one guy said to me, look, rather than buy a little action film out of the US with no real names in it, he goes, I still have to take that. I have to change the artwork. I have to change the title. I have to dub the film at 25,000 euros into my local language. He goes, I'd rather buy a locally made product here that's already in German, that maybe doesn't have big stars in it, but at least there's some recognizable faces. And I'd rather do that than buy something and take a chance and spend more money on it, from another country. Again, at that point, I started realizing the international market was not so. Now, this was years ago, but they were not as reliant on smaller, even medium-sized indie films. I mean, they're always looking for the blockbusters, the major titles, the 40, 50, $70 million budget in indie films, although there aren't many of those being made now, but back then there were quite a few of them. And he said, he says, it's less of a risk for me to pay $1 million license fee for my territory on a big name star than it would be to pay $100,000 or $200,000 on a smaller film that I just don't know what the results are going to be on it. Those are all kind of indications of how the market has evolved.
And in my position, being the executive director of a not-for-profit that represents the industry and association, I get two questions more than anything. Number one is, where can I get money to make my film? And if people are lucky enough to find money to make a film, the next question is, how do I get distribution? So I don't know what to tell them at that point.
Yeah.
What's the advice to somebody that just made something as low as, a $50,000 film all the way up to maybe like $1 million film? What do I tell them?
Yeah, I would say this, as challenging as the distribution world is now, for independent filmmakers, I do not recommend you try to go out and take a booth at the American film market and try to sell it yourself. I mean, I don't discourage you if that's what you want to do. The people who are buying and selling these movies have been doing this for their entire careers.
Yep.
They have the networks in place. They know who the honest buyers are and the dishonest ones are. They know the ins and outs. And so once you have a completed film, I'll work backwards to your first question. But, the thing about projects, there's sort of a three-legged chair. You need the financing, you need the talent, and you need the distribution.
Mm-hmm.
And of all three of those, probably financing is the most important.
Right.
Because if you don't have the money, you're not going to make a project. So
right.
How you go about finding that financing, there is no one answer. It could be your own money. It could be friends and family. It could be a grant that you get overseas. It's a little bit easier, at least it was historically, because governments, especially in Europe, saw the film business as more of an art form than a business. So there was more money available out of the cultural funds to make movies, to do that. The U.S. filmmakers have always had it a bit tougher in having to raise the money independently. And you piece it together. You find. That's what I've been doing for the last 3 years or so, is going back to all of my, two of which have been during COVID. So you can imagine how challenging that's been, but it's been that for everybody. But, trying to find people who are willing to take the risk, who love the film business. I would say this, if you're looking for a slam dunk way to make money, don't go into the film business. Buy real estate, do something, because you've got there's definitely a risk here from the time you look at 100 or 120 pages of script to the time it's a completed film up on the screen. There are literally thousands of things that can go wrong. And that's why when a film gets done and it works and it's magical and it really is, it's almost like it's miraculous that it happens. But dealing with professionals who know how to do it, and finding honest people that share your vision and are willing to, because they're going to be more than bumps in the road. There's going to be potholes and detours along the way, and you better have somebody that's on board there. But getting back to the issue of distribution, there's the organization called IFTA, IFTA. They're the sponsor of the American Film Market in Santa Monica every November. My companies were a member of it. I sat on the board of directors for 5 years. It's an organization of basically production and distribution companies, independents, both in film and television. I don't know how many there are now. With the last time I looked, there were probably 150 member companies from all around the world. Well, every one of these companies is looking for content. The companies that I was running, we could handle 10, 12 films a year. we couldn't produce that many. We could maybe produce 2 or 3 a year, but we
Right.
had to augment our annual lineup with films that were made by other producers. And so that's why we were out there. We were bird dogging everywhere, from festivals to, well, at the time, reading the trade papers. Variety and Hollywood Reporter found out who was making movies. We'd have friends in Georgia and Louisiana, and finding out what films were being done there, trying to get in on the ground floor. I mean, fortunately, we had a good reputation among our producers, and a lot of them would come back to us. They'd make a film one year, they'd do well with us, and they'd come back the next year or two and give us first shot at their next project. But if you have a completed film, you can try to submit it to Netflix yourself. They might or might not pay attention to you. There's a lot of sales companies that, I said IFTA is just one organization, but it's a good place to start. You can cold call there and speak to their acquisition departments, and get to the switchboard and say, I've got a completed film, or I've got a script, or I've got half the money and I've got a star. But like I said, if you've got the financing, you can find the distribution somewhere. The challenging part nowadays is putting the talent in there, and was a problem when I was running companies, and I think it's probably still a problem nowadays, getting access to, and by talent, I don't mean that people who are starring in your movies are not talented. What I'm saying is they don't have the marketable name
Right.
value.
Yeah, name recognition.
Because when you're sitting with a buyer from overseas and you start talking about the project, one of the first things they say is who's in it, or who's going to be in it. And if you can mention a name or two that they immediately recognize, and you're on much more solid ground than if you have to say, well, they had the third lead in the 4th season of Desperate Housewives. I mean, if you have to start explaining who the person is, it doesn't mean they're not talented. But it does probably mean that they don't have a lot of marketability or a lot of saleability at that point.
Like we talked about how they don't really teach distribution in film schools. If somebody wanted to get into the distribution side and say, like, I mean, you kind of almost stumbled into it yourself. You said, you were in the production side, and somebody says, you know what, I love the film industry, but man, I don't really like that production side of the industry.
Right.
Like, how would somebody get into distribution?
It's a good question, because the distribution business now is very different than when I got into it, or even 10 or 20 years ago. There were constantly people coming in. It was almost like musical chairs. I mean, there were so many different companies, and there was so much vibrancy in the business that as one person left one company to go to another one, somebody else came over from a different company, and then it was this constant, I won't say recycling, but it would, people were moving sort of in the same circle. What's happened with the changes in distribution into streaming now, because frankly, you just don't need as many people in a distribution company as you used to. I mean, we used to have departments with 2 or 3 people in each department. One, they'd be doing the marketing, they'd be doing the key art campaign, or they'd be cutting the trailer, or there'd be the human resources department. There was the director of operations was a big deal. There was the contract administration department. We'd have 2 or 3 people just doing deliveries, sending masters around the world and making sure that they were closed captioned and getting on a FedEx on time so that your distributor in Belgium could make an opening date. There's not a lot of negotiating that goes on, let's put it that way. If I was selling a film to Netflix, they're only going to have a certain limited bandwidth as far as what's going to be negotiable or not. And they're going to have a delivery list saying, this is what you have to deliver. No ifs, ands, or buts. You make it happen. And the selling is, yes, there's some negotiating involved, but again, basically, they're going to say, here's the parameters of where we can license this film. If you don't want it, fine, go deal with the other Netflix. Oh, wait, there is no other Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
And, speaking of which, I was thinking about this the other day, and not to digress, but a friend of mine says, how can Netflix spend $18 billion a year on content? I said, well, figure it out. They've got 250 million subscribers around the world, and figure out $10, $12, $15 a month. They're making a couple of $1 billion a month, and,
Yeah.
35 billion dollars a year. Yeah, you can spend $20 billion creating and acquiring content. I mean, it's more than all the studios. They're filling their own needs. And if you come to them with an independent project, yeah, they'll go to Sundance and compete for the top 2 or 3 titles and spend a lot of money there. But if you don't have one of those top 2 or 3 titles, they're going to be less interested, because
Right.
they just don't need that space. And, and some of them, Disney Plus, not going to be buying horror films.
Right.
Some of them have their own niche that they're looking to acquire content for. So to answer your question about getting into the distribution business, the business has changed so much. It's almost like we're less distributors than we are kind of marketing companies, and it takes fewer companies to do that. So take me, for instance. Somebody said, Larry, if your career was a football game, you're in the 4th quarter. And I looked at him and I said, yeah, well, at least I'm not in the 2-minute warning like you are. I've kind of pivoted more, I won't say away from distribution, because distribution is still an extremely important part of the business. What I tell investors now is that what you're getting with me is not only a producer, but also somebody who has 40 plus years of experience in dealing with the worldwide distribution. So I know what to look for. There's still some people around that I wouldn't work with them, if you paid me to. I know who I can kind of guide you through the pitfalls of that part of the business. But I've kind of pivoted away from day-to-day distribution and calling the UK at 6 o'clock in the morning in Los Angeles time, and calling Japan at 7 o'clock LA time. It's and more toward the production financing part of the business, because one thing that this industry will always need, it will always need content.
Mm-hmm.
And the distribution landscape changes dramatically. But if you have content, good content, that a large number of people want to see, there'll always be room for you. And you just got to make it, and you got to get it out there and get people to see it.
Larry, I think that's a tremendous way to end the conversation, is just the importance of good content, because no matter what, whether it's technology, distribution, all of these different things, it all comes back to the need for good quality content. So
absolutely. And that will never change.
Correct. Right. So I can't thank you enough for spending time with us today and sharing your perspective of more than 40 years in the industry. We really appreciate you being on the Film Florida podcast with us today.
Well, John, it was my pleasure to be here. I love what you're doing with your podcast, and it's been great talking to you.
Thank you so much.
Take care now.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Film Florida podcast. For more information about Film Florida, go to filmflorida.org or visit our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. If you're not already a member of Film Florida, please consider joining at filmflorida.org. If you like what you hear on the podcast, please consider going to our website and donating $20.22 for our 2022 fundraising campaign. Check out the Film Florida merchandise at filmflorida.creator.com.
spring.com. And please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast.